things, haven't we? Yet there's still this feeling, this gap when you think about true human-like intelligence.
Definitely. Things like learning quickly from just a few examples or common sense.
Exactly. And understanding why we decide something or being flexible when something totally new comes up.
Yeah, strong generalization is still a huge hurdle.
Right. And our sources today, they propose something quite compelling. Maybe we've been missing a key ingredient, the explicit role of, well, time within these networks.
Ah, that's a fascinating angle. Because current AI, while great at specific tasks, often lacks that fluid adaptability we see in biology.
You mean how we reason over time, build up and understand?
Precisely. That unfolding of events, it seems deeply tied to the temporal dynamics in our own brains.
Okay, so that leads us right into our main topic today, the continuous thought machine, or CTM.
Hmm.
And this isn't just a small change, right? It's presented as a fundamentally different way to build neural nets, one that explicitly bakes in this idea of neural timing.
That's the claim, a new architecture.
So, our mission for this deep dive is to really get into the core innovations of the CTM. We want to explore how this focus on time might help AI overcome some of those limitations we mentioned, perhaps by mirroring biological processes more closely.
And we've got the paper here outlining the design, the experiments, plenty to dig into.
Great. The paper kicks off with some really novel concepts. Where should we start? Maybe that first big innovation.
Yeah, let's start with the decoupled internal dimension. I think that's fundamental to understanding the CTM's whole approach. It's quite different.
Okay, decoupled internal dimension. Let's unpack that. In a neural network context, what does that actually mean? What does it give us?
Okay, so imagine an internal space, right? Inside the network, but it's separate from the direct input. This is where the paper suggests thought can unfold.
A space for thought.
Kind of. Now, we've had recurrence in networks before, like RNNs for sequential data, but the CTM uses this internal dimension specifically to generate and evolve patterns of neural activity across time. It's not just about processing a sequence step by step.
Ah, see. So it's less about just reacting to the input sequence and more about fostering some kind of internal dynamic process, like internal rumination almost.
That's a good way to put it. It's definitely moving beyond simple stimulus response. It allows for this dynamic processing internally.
So it's not just layers processing information linearly. The CTM has this dedicated space where activity can develop over these discrete steps, these internal ticks, as the paper calls them.
Exactly, an internal clock governing its own process. Okay. And by stepping through these tips, the CTM can build up really quite complex time-dependent neural dynamic.
And this ties back to biology.
Directly. It resonates with the idea that the precise timing of neural events is critical for computation in the brain. So it's a shift from just processing sequences to actively creating a dynamic internal state over time.
That's a pretty significant architectural shift. What's the second key innovation enabling these richer dynamics? You mentioned NLMs.
Right, the neuron-level models, or NLMs. This is another core idea. It's a different way of thinking about how individual neurons compute things, the sort of mid-level abstraction.
Okay, how so? Different from, say, a real U activation.
Very different. Standard functions like ReLU are static, right? Basically on or off based on the immediate input. But with NLMs, each neuron actually has its own internal set of weights.
Wait, individual weights per neuron? That sounds like it could massively increase the parameters.
It does increase them, yeah. But the paper argues it's still relatively simple to implement in existing frameworks, and it scales. The crucial difference is how they work.
Go on.
An NLM doesn't just look at the current input signal. It processes a short history of the incoming signals, the pre-activations, to decide its next activation state.
So, like a tiny memory for each neuron, influencing its own firing based on recent history.
Exactly. It gives individual neurons a kind of short-term memory, allowing for much more nuanced, context-aware processing than a simple switch.
Which, the paper notes, leads to more complex and varied activation patterns emerging naturally compared to the static functions.
Precisely. These NLMs introduce temporal sensitivity right down at the neuron level. That really feeds into those rich internal dynamics we were talking about.
Okay, so we have this internal space evolving over ticks and neurons with their own temporal sensitivity. How do these dynamic neurons actually coordinate to perform conversations? You mentioned synchronization.
Yes, neural synchronization, that's the next piece. We hear about brain regions synchronizing, right?
Right? Different areas firing in coordinated ways.
The CTM models this by computing weighted interdot products between the recent activation histories of pairs of neurons.
Okay, comparing recent activity patterns between neurons.
And they add learnable exponential decay factors for each pair. Think of it like, well, like the AI is listening to the conversations between neuron pairs, but paying more attention to some based on learned weights, and maybe older parts of the conversation fade out due to the decay.
So it's not just who is firing, but how their recent firing patterns align or correlate over time. And the importance of those alignments can change.
Exactly. And this synchronization value itself becomes a really powerful latent representation. It's what the CTM uses for downstream tasks.
Oh, so synchronization is the key output representation, not just the final activations.
That's a key insight they found worked best. And if you look at figure 4 in the paper, it visualizes this beautifully. You see these diverse, structured patterns of neuron activity evolving over the internal ticks. That's the raw material for calculating the synchronization.
So for you, the listener, this means the AI isn't just learning what is in the data, but maybe how different parts of its internal processing are interacting and coordinating over time. It feels like a deeper level of representation.
I think that's a fair way to characterize the potential, yes.
Now, one of the most interesting claims I thought was about adaptive computation emerging naturally. This isn't something they explicitly coded in.
No, and that's a really crucial point. Often, models have a fixed computational cost, right? Or if they adapt, it's through some specific mechanism added on top.
Like an early exit strategy or something?
Exactly. But the CTM they found can be trained without any hard limits on the number of internal ticks it uses for different inputs.
So it might spend more thinking time, more ticks on a harder problem.
That's what seems to happen. The ability to use variable compute just emerges from the architecture and the training process itself. It's not forced.
An inductive bias, then.
Precisely. It seems biased towards tailoring the processing complexity, the number of ticks, to the difficulty of the input data. Like we might mull over a tricky question but answer an easy one instantly.
Makes sense. And figure 2 shows this, right? How ticks can be cut short based on a certainty threshold.
Yes, that figure demonstrates this adaptive compute in action. It stops thinking when it's confident enough.
Okay, fascinating concept. So how does this whole new architecture actually perform on standard AI tests? They looked at ImageNet 1K classification.
They did. And it's important, as they state, to remember the goal here wasn't necessarily to beat the state of the art on ImageNet right out of the gate.
Right, it's more a proof of concept. Demonstrating this novel approach using Earl dynamics works on a context task.
Exactly. It's about showing the potential of using these time-dependent dynamics as the core representation for something like image classification.
So what were the results like with that ResNet 152 backbone?
They achieved 72.47% top 1 and 89.89% top 5 accuracy on the validation set.
Which, okay, isn't top of the leaderboard, but definitely respectable as a first showing for such a different approach.
Absolutely. And they suggest further tuning could improve that significantly. But the key was demonstrating viability.
And figure 3 seemed interesting, showing how confidence evolves over those internal ticks.
Yeah, that figure connects the number of internal ticks to the top 5 accuracy. It shows how predictions refined as the CTM thinks longer. And interestingly, the model's own certainty, especially after more ticks, becomes a better predictor of whether it's actually right.
And figure 5, the visualization of attention, it looks like it's shifting focus across the image over time.
It does. It seems to dynamically shift its gaze, as it were, across different image regions during those internal ticks, while it processes the input. Very different from a static attention map.
Okay, beyond images, they also tested it on something requiring more abstract reasoning. 2D mazes. That seems like a very different kind of challenge.
It really is, and they chose it specifically to see if the CTM could show more, well, human-like reasoning. Planning, maybe building an internal model of the maze.
Because standard models might just memorize paths on those tasks.
They can, yes. They might not learn a general strategy.
So how did they set up the maze task for the CTM?
The model had to output the actual sequence of moves to the goal, not just classify pixels. And crucially, they removed positional embeddings from the input image.
Ah, so it couldn't cheat by knowing coordinates. It had to navigate relationally.
Exactly. Navigate based on the structure it perceives as it explores. Then they compared it to LSTM and feed-forward baselines.
And the results were pretty stark, weren't they?
Quite compelling, yes. As shown in Figure 7, the baselines, especially the feed-forward one, showed clear signs of overfitting memorizing the training mazes. The LSTM did better, but still struggled.
But the CTM?
The CTM achieved high accuracy without overfitting. It suggests a much better inductive bias for this kind of sequential reasoning and planning task. It generalized better.
And figure 8 visualizes its process. It looks quite methodical.
It does. You can see the attention weights moving along a plausible path through the maze across the internal picks, heading towards the exit. It feels like a deliberate exploration.
And the paper mentions episodic future thinking. What's that about?
Well, because it solves the maze step by step, apparently planning ahead without explicit coordinates, it hints at an ability to internally simulate or project future steps based on the maze structure it's building in its internal state.
Wow. And it generalized.
Remarkably well, according to Figure 9. It could solve bigger mazes, longer path than it was trained on, without changes. That strongly suggests it learned a general procedure for maze solving, not just specific layouts. It points towards building a better internal world model or cognitive map.
That's seriously impressive for generalization. Okay, they also went back to image classification with CFAR 10, but this time compared it to humans.
Yes, CFAR 10. They benchmarked the CTM against a feed-forward net, an LSTM, and average human performance. They used a similar backbone here to really isolate the effect of the CTM's temporal processing.
And how did it stack up?
Interestingly, the CTM got the best test accuracy among the models. And Figure 10 points out it had good calibration, and get this, it tended to make errors similar to the ones humans make on CFAR 10.
Failing in a human-like way. That is fascinating. What could that imply?
Well, it might suggest the CTM is learning to rely on similar visual features as humans do, making it vulnerable to the same kinds of visual ambiguities or distractors.
Interesting. And do they look deeper into the dynamic?
Yes, Figure 12 shows the CTM uses more complex neural dynamics than the LSTM, even on CIFAR 10. Figures 13 and 14 then explore things like model width and thinking time, more ticks, showing how these impact activity, diversity, and accuracy on CIFAR 100, suggesting again that more computation, more time helps the CTM.
So it seems robust across different image tasks. What about non-image, sequential data? They tested sorting and parity, right?
They did. These tasks test the ability to generate sequential outputs and maintain state. For sorting numbers, Figure 15 shows something neat. The CTM used adaptive weight times number of ticks that correlated with how much the numbers changed in the sequence.
So it spent more time when the sorting step was bigger.
It seems so. And for the parity task, calculating cumulative parity of a binary string, Figures 18 and 19 show that giving it more thinking time, more ticks, directly improved the accuracy of the final parity calculation.
And figure 21 shows it attending sequentially to the input bits.
Yes, visualizing the attention confirms it processes the sequence step by step, as you'd expect for parity.
So it handles sequential generation and state maintenance too. And quick mentions of question answering and RL.
Just brief examples. For Q&A with MNES digits and math, Figure 25 shows the CTM seemingly calculating intermediate results sequentially.
Like working through the problem step by step.
Exactly. And in RL, on classic control and a mini-grid navigation task, Figure 27 shows it performing competitively with LSTMs, using its activation history as its state in these partially observable environments.
Okay, so across this really diverse set of tasks, images, mazes, sequences, even RL basics, the CTM seems to offer something genuinely different because of how it handles time and dynamic.
That's the picture they paint, yes.
And towards the end, they connect it to other research and look at.
Right. They link it to work on adaptive computation, iterative reasoning, and other biologically inspired models like liquid time constant networks or spiking neural nets.
So it fits into a broader context.
And they suggest future directions. Using synchronization as memory, maybe exploring plasticity or gradient-free learning with it, using that rich synchronization representation for multimodal AI.
Lots of potential avenues.
Definitely. And they also mention learning from early failures. Apparently, just using the raw latent activations wasn't as effective as shifting to use this time-independent synchronization measure as the core representation.
It's always good to hear about the research journey, the trial and error. Okay, so let's try to wrap this up. What are the main takeaways for you from this deep dive into the continuous thought machine?
I think the fundamental takeaway is this explicit integration of neural timing, the decoupled internal dimension for unfolding thought, the neuron-level models adding temporal sensitivity, and using neural synchronization as the key representation. That whole package is the core innovation.
And this leads to emergent properties.
Yes, like the adaptive computation, and it produces behaviors that seem qualitatively different from standard networks. The maze solving, the generalization, the human-like error patterns.
It points towards potential.
Potential, definitely. Potential to maybe address some of those deep limitations in current AI flexibility, data efficiency, maybe even common sense down the line by being architecturally more aligned with biological principles.
It really does underscore the synergy that's possible between neuroscience and machine learning, doesn't it? Sometimes AI takes inspiration from the brain, but maybe superficially. But the CTM work feels like a deeper engagement, seriously considering how things like time and dynamic activity patterns actually shape intelligence in biological systems.
It's a compelling example of that, yes.
It really leaves you wondering, doesn't it? What other breakthroughs might be waiting at that intersection? If we keep looking closely at the computational principles of biology, especially those temporal dynamics, maybe that's where the path to more robust, flexible AI truly lies. Something to think about.